Welcome to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews, bringing you a southern perspective on books, movies, music, and much, much more. Stick around for a while, you just might hear something wicked. Well, hello again, and welcome to Wicked Shizuku's Reviews Reads Monday playlist. This is episode 36, and I hope that you're going to enjoy this one as we are continuing with James Monroe's second inaugural speech. So, we're jumping right into it. Second Inaugural Address of James Monroe, March 5th, 1821. Fellow citizens, I shall not attempt to describe the grateful emotions which the new and very distinguished proof of the confidence of my fellow citizens evinced by my re-election to this high trust has excited in my bosom. The approbation which it announces of my conduct in the preceding term affords me a consolation which I shall profoundly feel through life. The general accord with which it has been expressed adds to the great and never-ceasing obligations which it imposes. To merit the great and never-ceasing obligations it imposes, to merit the continuance of this good opinion, and to carry it with me into my retirement as the solace of advancing years, will be the object of my most zealous and unceasing efforts. Having no pretensions to the high and commanding claims of my predecessors, whose names are so much more conspicuously identified with our revolution, and who contributed so preeminently to promote its success, I consider myself rather as the instrument than the cause of the union which has prevailed in the late election, in surmounting, in favor of my humble pretensions and difficulties which so often produce division in like occurrences. It is obvious that other powerful causes, indicating the great strength and stability of our union, have essentially contributed to draw you together. That these powerful causes exist, and that they are permanent, is my fixed opinion. That they may produce a like accord in all questions touching, however remotely, the liberty, prosperity, and happiness of our country, will always be the object of my most fervent prayers to the Supreme Author of all good. In a government which is founded by the people, who possess exclusively the sovereignty, it seems proper that the person who may be placed by their suffrages in this high trust should declare on commencing its duties the principles on which he intends to conduct the administration. If the person thus elected has served the preceding term, an opportunity is afforded for him to review its principal occurrences and to give such further explanation respecting them as in his judgment may be useful to his constituents. The events of one year have influence on those of another, and in like manner of a proceeding on the succeeding administration. The movements of a great nation are connected in all their parts. If errors have been committed, they ought to be corrected. If the policy is sound, it ought to be supported. It is by thorough knowledge of a whole subject that our fellow citizens are enabled to judge correctly of the past and to give a proper direction to the future. Just before the commencement of the last term, the United States had concluded a war with a very powerful nation on conditions equal and honorable to both parties. The events of that war are too recent and too deeply impressed on the memory of all to require a development from me. Our commerce had been in great measure driven from the sea. Our Atlantic and inland frontiers were invaded in almost every part. The waste of life along our coast and on some parts of our inland frontiers to the defense of which our gallant and patriotic citizens were called was immense, in addition to which not less than $120 million were added at its end to the public debt. Wow. As soon as the war had terminated, the nation, admonished by its events, resolved to place itself in a situation which should be better calculated to prevent the reoccurrence of a like evil. And in case it should reoccur, to mitigate its calamities. With this view, after reducing our land force to the basis of a peace establishment, which has been further modified since, provision was made for the construction of fortifications at proper points through the whole extent of our coast, and such an augmentation of our naval force as should be well adapted to both purposes. The law making this provision were passed in 1815 and 1816, and it has been since the constant effort of the executive to carry them into effect. The advantages of these fortifications and of an augmented naval force in the extent contemplated in a point of economy has been fully illustrated by a report of the Board of Engineers and Naval Commissioners lately communicated to Congress, by which it appears that in an invasion by 20,000 men with a correspondent naval force in a campaign of 6 months only, the whole expense of the construction of the works would be defrayed by the difference in the sum necessary to maintain the force, which would be adequate to our defense with the aid of those works, and that which would be incurred without them. The reason of this difference is obvious. If fortifications are judiciously placed on our great inlets, as distant from our cities as circumstances will permit, they will form the only points of attack, and the enemy will be detained there by a small regular force of sufficient time to enable our militia to collect and repair to that on which the attack is made. A force adequate to the enemy, collected at that single point, with suitable preparation for such others as might be menaced, is all that would be requisite. But if there were no fortifications, then the enemy might go where he pleased, and changing his position and sailing from place to place, our force must be called out and spread in vast numbers along the whole coast, and on both sides of every bay and river, as high up in each as it might be navigable for ships of war. By these fortifications, supported by our navy, to which they would afford like support, we should present to other powers an armed front from St. Croix to the Sabine, which would protect in the event of war our whole coast and interior from invasion, and even in the wars of other powers in which we were neutral, they would be found eminently useful, as by keeping their public ships at a distance from our cities, peace and order in them would be preserved, and the government would be protected from insult. It need scarcely be remarked that these measures have not been resorted to in a spirit of hostility to other powers. Such a disposition does not exist toward any power. Peace and goodwill have been, and will hereafter be, cultivated with all, and by the most faithful regard to justice. They have been dictated by a love of peace, of economy, and an earnest desire to save the lives of our fellow citizens from that destruction, and our country from that devastation, which are inseparable from war when it finds us unprepared for it. It is believed, and experience has shown, that such a preparation is the best expedient that can be resorted to prevent war. I add with much pleasure that considerable progress has already been made in these measures of defense, and that they will be completed in a few years, considering the great extent and importance of the object, if the plan be zealously and steadily persevered in. The conduct of the government in which what relates to foreign powers is always an object of the highest importance to the nation. Its agriculture, commerce, manufactures, fisheries, revenue, in short, its peace, may all be affected by it. Attention is therefore due to this subject. At the period averted to the powers of Europe, after having been engaged in long and destructive wars with each other, had concluded a peace, which happily still exists. Our peace with the power with whom we had been engaged had also been concluded. The war between Spain and the colonies in South America, which had commenced many years before, was then the only conflict that remained unsettled, this being a contest between different parts of the same community, in which other powers had not interfered, was not affected by their accommodations. This contest was considered at an early stage by my predecessor a civil war in which the parties were entitled to equal rights in our ports. This decision, the first made by any power, being formed on great consideration of the comparative strength and resources of the parties, the length of time and successful opposition made by the colonies, and of all other circumstances on which it ought to depend, was in strict accord with the law of nations. Congress has invariably acted on this principle, having made no change in our relations with either party. Our attitude has therefore been that of neutrality between them, which has been maintained by the government with the strictest impartiality. No aid has been afforded to either, nor has any privilege been enjoyed by the one which has not been equally open to the other party, and every exertion has been made in its power to enforce the execution of the laws prohibiting illegal equipments with equal rigor against both. By this equality between the parties, their public vessels have been received in our ports on the same footing. They have enjoyed an equal right to purchase and export arms, munitions of war, and every other supply, the exportation of all articles, whatever being permitted under laws which were passed long before the commencement of the contest. Our citizens have traded equally with both, and their commerce with each has been alike protected by the government. Respecting the attitude which it may be proper for the United States to maintain hereafter between the parties, I have no hesitation in stating it as my opinion, that the neutrality heretofore observed should still be adhered to. From the change in the government of Spain and the negotiation now depending, invited by the Cortes and accepted by the colonies, it may be presumed that their differences will be settled on the terms proposed by the colonies. Should the war be continued, the United States, regarding its occurrences, will always have it in their power to adopt such measures respecting it as their honor and interest may require. Shortly after the general peace, a band of adventurers took advantage of this conflict and of the facility which it afforded to establish a system of buccaneering in the neighboring seas, to the great annoyance of the commerce of the United States, and was representative of that of other powers. Of this spirit, and of its injurious bearings on the United States, strong proofs were afforded by the establishment at Amelia Island, and the purposes to which it was made instrumental by this band in 1817, and by the occurrences which took place in other parts of Florida in 1818, the details of which in both instances are too well known to require to be now recited. I am satisfied, had a less decisive course been adopted, that the worst consequences would have resulted from it. We have seen that these checks, decisive as they were not sufficient to crush the piratical spirit. Many culprits brought within our limits have been condemned to suffer death, the punishment due to that atrocious crime. The decisions of upright and enlightened tribunals fall equally on all whose crimes subject them, by fair interpretation of the law, to its censure. It belongs to the executive not to suffer the executions under these decisions to transcend the great purpose for which punishment is necessary, the full benefit of example being secured. Policy, as well as humanity, equally forbids that they should be carried further. I have acted on this principle, pardoning those who appear to have been led astray by ignorance of the criminality of the acts they have committed, and suffering the law to take effect on those only in whose favor no extenuating circumstances could be urged. Great confidence is entertained that the late treaty with Spain, which has been ratified by both parties, and the ratification whereof have been exchanged, has placed the relations of the two countries on a basis of permanent friendship. The provision made by it for such of our citizens as have claims on Spain of the character described will, it is presumed, be very satisfactory to them, and the boundary which is established between the territories of the parties westward of the Mississippi, heretofore in dispute, has, it is thought, been settled on conditions just and advantageous to both. But to the acquisition of Florida too much importance cannot be attached. It secures to the United States a territory important in itself, and whose importance is such increased by its bearing on many of the highest interests of the Union. It opens to several of the neighboring states a free passage to the ocean, through the province seated by several rivers, having their sources high up within their limits. It secures us against all future annoyance from powerful Indian tribes. It gives us several excellent harbors in the Gulf of Mexico for ships of war of the largest size. It covers by its position in the Gulf of the Mississippi and other great waters within our extended limits. and thereby enables the United States to afford complete protection to the vast and very valuable productions of our whole Western country, which find a market through those streams. By a treaty with the British government bearing date on the 20th of October 1818, the convention regulating the commerce between the United States and Great Britain concluded on the 3rd of July 1815, which was about expiring, was revived and continued for the term of 10 years from the time of its expiration. By that treaty also the differences which had arisen under the Treaty of Ghent respecting to the right claimed by the United States for their citizens to take and cure fish on the coast of His Britannic Majesty's dominions in America, with other differences on important interests, were adjusted to the satisfaction of both parties. No agreement has yet been entered into respecting the commerce between the United States and British dominions in the West Indies and on this continent. The restraints imposed on that commerce by Great Britain and reciprocated by the United States on a principle of defense continue still in force. The negotiation with France for the regulation of the commercial relations between the two countries, which in the course of the last summer had been commenced at Paris, has since been transferred to this city, and will be pursued on the part of the United States in the spirit of conciliation, and with an earnest desire that it may terminate in an arrangement satisfactory to both parties. Our relations with the Barbary powers are preserved in the same state and by the same means that were employed when I came into this office. As early as 1801, it was found necessary to send a squadron into the Mediterranean for the protection of our commerce, and no period has intervened, a short term excepted, when it was thought advisable to withdraw it. The great interests which the United States have in the Pacific, in commerce and in the fisheries, have also made it necessary to maintain a naval force there. In disposing of this force in both instances, the most effectual measures in our power have been taken, without interfering with its other duties, for the suppression of the slave trade and of piracy in the neighboring seas. The situation of the United States in regard to their resources, the extent of their revenue, and the facility with which it is raised affords a most gratifying spectacle. The payment of nearly $67 millions of the public debt, with the great progress made in measures of defense and in other improvements of various kinds since the late war, are conclusive proofs of this extraordinary prosperity, especially when it is recollected that these expenditures have been defrayed without a burden on the people, the direct tax and excise having been repealed soon after the conclusion of the late war, and the revenue applied to these great objects have been raised in a manner not to be felt. Our great resources, therefore, remain untouched for any purpose which may affect the vital interests of the nation. For all such purposes they are inexhaustible. They are more especially to be found in the virtue, patriotism, and intelligence of our fellow citizens, and in the devotion with which they would yield up, by any just measure of taxation, all their property in support of the rights and honor of their country. Under the present depression of prices, affecting all the productions of the country and every branch of industry, Proceeding from causes explained on a former occasion, the revenue has considerably diminished, the effect of which has been to compel Congress either to abandon these great measures of defense or to resort to loans or internal taxes to supply the deficiency. On the presumption that this depression and the deficiency in the revenue arising from it would be temporary, loans were authorized for the demands of the last and present year. Anxious to relieve my fellow citizens in 1817 from every burthen which could be dispensed with, and the state of the treasury permitting it, I recommended the repeal of the internal taxes, knowing that such relief was in peculiarity necessary. In consequence of the great exertions made in the late war. I made that recommendation under a pledge that should the public exigencies require a recurrence to them at any time, while I remained in this trust, I would with equal promptitude perform the duty which would be alike incumbent on me. By the experiment now making it will be seen by the next session of Congress whether the revenue shall have been so augmented as to be adequate to all these necessary purposes. Should the deficiency still continue, and especially should it be probable that it would be permanent, the course to be pursued appears to me to be obvious. I am satisfied that under certain circumstances, loans may be resorted to with great advantage. I am equally well satisfied, as a general rule, that the demands of the current year, especially in time of peace, should be provided for by the revenue of that year. I have never dreaded, nor have I ever shunned, in any situation in which I have been placed making appeals to the virtue of patriotism of my fellow citizens, well knowing that they could never be made in vain, especially in times of great emergency or for purposes of high national importance. Independently of the exigency of the case, many considerations of great weight urge a policy having in view of a provision of revenue to meet to a certain extent the demands of the nation, without relying altogether on the precarious resource of foreign commerce. I am satisfied that internal duties and excises, with corresponding imposts on foreign articles of the same kind, would, without imposing any serious burdens on the people, enhance the price of produce, promote our manufacturers, and augment the revenue, at the same time that they made it more secure and permanent. The care of the Indian tribes within our limits has long been an essential part of our system, but unfortunately it has not been executed in a manner to accomplish all the objects intended by it. We have treated them as independent nations without their having any substantial pretensions to that rank. The distinction has flattered their pride, retarded their improvement, and in many instances paved the way to their destruction. The progress of our settlements westward, supported as they are by a dense population, has constantly driven them back, with almost the total sacrifice of the lands which they have been compelled to abandon. They have claims on the magnanimity, and I may add, on the justice of this nation, which we must all feel. We should become their real benefactors. We should perform the office of their great father, the endearing title which they emphatically give to the chief magistrate of our Union. Their sovereignty over vast territories should cease, in lieu of which the right of soil should be secured to each individual as his posterity in competent portions. And for the territory thus ceded by each tribe, some reasonable equivalent should be granted, to be vested in permanent funds for the support of civil government over them and for the education of their children, for their instruction in the arts of husbandry, and to provide sustenance for them until they could provide it for themselves. My earnest hope is that Congress will digest some plan founded on these principles, with such improvements as their wisdom may suggest, and carry it into effect as soon as it may be practicable. Europe is again unsettled, and the prospect of war increasing. Should the flame light up in any quarter, how far it may extend, it is impossible to foresee. It is our particular felicity to be altogether unconnected with the causes which produce this menacing aspect elsewhere. With every power we are in perfect enmity, and it is our interest to remain so, if it be practicable on just conditions. I see no reasonable cause to apprehend variance with any power, unless it proceed from a violation of our maritime rights. In these contests, should they occur, and to whatever extent they may be carried, we shall be neutral. But as a neutral power, we have rights which it is our duty to maintain. For like injuries, it will be incumbent on us to seek redress in a spirit of amity. In full confidence that injuring none would knowingly injure us. For more imminent dangers, we should be prepared, and it should always be recollected that such preparation adapted to circumstances and sanctioned by the judgment and wishes of our constituents cannot fail to have a good effect in averting dangers of every kind. We should recollect also that the season of peace is best adapted to these preparations. If we turn our attention, fellow citizens, more immediately to the internal concerns of our country, and more especially to those on which its future welfare depends, we have every reason to anticipate the happiest results. It is now rather more than 44 years since we declared our independence, and 37 since it was acknowledged. The talents and virtues which were displayed in that great struggle were a sure presage of all that has since followed. A people who were able to surmount in their infant state such great perils would be more competent as they rose into manhood to repel any which they might meet in their progress. Their physical strength would be more adequate to foreign danger, and the practice of self-government, aided by the light of experience, could not fail to produce an effect equally salutary on all those questions connected with the internal organization. These favorable anticipations have been realized. In our whole system, national and state, we have shunned all the defects which unceasingly preyed on the vitals and destroyed the ancient republics. In them there were distinct orders, a nobility, and a people, or the people governed in one assembly. Thus, in the one instant, there was a perpetual conflict between the orders in society for the ascendancy, in which the victory of either terminated in the overthrow of the government and the ruin of the state; in the other, in which the people governed in a body, and whose dominions seldom exceeded the dimensions of a country in one of our states, a tumultuous and disorderly movement, permitted only a transitory existence. In this great nation there is but one order, that of the people, whose power, by a peculiarity or happy improvement of the representative principle, is transferred from them, without impairing in the slightest degree their sovereignty, to bodies of their own creation, and to persons elected by themselves, and in the full extent necessary for all the purposes of free, enlightened, and efficient government. The whole system is elective, the complete sovereignty being in the people, and every officer in every department deriving his authority from and being responsible to them for his conduct. Our career has corresponded with this great outline. Perfection in our organization could not have been expected in the outset, either in the national or state governments, or in tracing the line between their respective powers. But no serious conflict has arisen, nor any contest but such as are managed by argument and by a fair appeal to the good sense of the people; and many of the defects which experience had clearly demonstrated in both governments have been remedied. By steadily pursuing this course in this spirit, there is every reason to believe that our system will soon attain the highest degree of perfection of which human institutions are capable, and that the movement in all its branches will exhibit such a degree of order and harmony as to command the admiration and respect of the civilized world. Our physical attainments have not been less eminent. 25 years ago, the river Mississippi was shut up, and our western brethren had no outlet for their commerce. What has been the progress since that time? The river has not only become the property of the United States from its source to the ocean, with all its tributary streams, with the exception of the upper part of the Red River only, but Louisiana, with a fair and liberal boundary on the western side, and the Floridas on the eastern, have been ceded to us. The United States now enjoy the complete and uninterrupted sovereignty over the whole territory from St. Croix to the Sabine. New states settled from among ourselves in this and in other parts have been admitted into our union in equal participation in the national sovereignty with the original states. Our population has augmented in an astonishing degree, and extended in every direction. We now, fellow citizens, comprise within our limits the dimensions and facilities or faculties of a great power under a government possessing all the energies of any government ever known to the old world, with an utter incapacity to oppress the people. Entering with these views the office which I have just solemnly sworn to execute with fidelity and to the utmost of my ability, I derive great satisfaction from a knowledge that I shall be assisted in the several departments by the very enlightened and upright citizens from whom I have received so much aid in the preceding term, with full confidence in the continuance of that candor and generous indulgence from my fellow citizens at large, which I heretofore experienced, and with a firm reliance on the protection of Almighty God, I shall forthwith commence the duties of the high trust to which you have called me. And that was the second inaugural address of James Monroe. And I shall be right back after this break. And welcome back. Thank you for sticking around for so long. Congratulations. And thanks for not giving up on me. So, I will be continuing on in this episode with a Scottish fairy tale. Um, it's pretty much just a collection of Scottish fairy tales that has been put together. There's no particular author to this one. So, they're all this is what their country tells their children. So, I assume. So, um, today, we will be reading the story The Black Bull of Norroway. In bygone days, long centuries ago, there lived a widowed queen who had 3 daughters, and this widowed queen was so poor and had fallen upon such evil days that she and her daughters had often much ado to get enough to eat. So the eldest princess determined that she would set out into the world to seek her fortune, and her mother was quite willing that she should go do so, for, said she, "'tis better to work abroad than to starve at home." But as there was an old henwife living near the castle, who was said to be a witch, and to be able to foretell the future, the queen sent the princess to her cottage, before she set out on her travels, to ask her in which of the 4 arts she ought to go, in order to find the best fortune. "Thou needst gang nae further than my back door, hinny," answered the old dame, who had always felt very sorry for the queen and her pretty daughters, and was glad to do them a good turn. So the princess ran through the passage to the henwife's back door and peeped out, and what should she see but a magnificent coach, drawn by 6 beautiful cream-colored horses, coming along the road. Greatly excited at this unusual sight, she hurried back to the kitchen and told the henwife that what she had seen. Aweel, ye've seen your fortune," said the old woman, in a tone of satisfaction, "for that coach and 6 is coming for thee." Such enough, the coach and 6 stopped at the gate of the castle, and the second princess came running down to the cottage to tell her sister to make haste, because it was waiting for her. Delighted beyond measure at the wonderful luck that had come to her, she hurried home, and saying farewell to her mother and sisters, took her seat within, and the horses galloped off immediately. And I've heard tell that they draw her to the palace of a great and wealthy prince who married her, but that is outside my story. A few weeks afterwards, the second princess thought that she would do as her sister had done, and go down to the henwife's cottage and tell her that she too was going out into the world to seek her fortune. And of course, in her heart of hearts, she hoped that what had happened to her sister would happen to her also. And curious to say, it did, for the old henwife sent her to look out her back door, and she went, and lo and behold, another coach and 6 was coming along the road. And when she went and told the old woman, she smiled upon her kindly, and told her to hurry home, for the coach and 6 was her fortune also, and that it had come for her. So she too ran home, and got into her grand carriage, and was driven away. And of course, after all these lucky happenings, the youngest princess was anxious to try what her fortune might be. So the very night, in high good humor, she tripped away down to the old witch's cottage. She too was told to look out the back door, and she was only too glad to do so, for she fully expected to see a third coach and 6 coming rolling along the high road, straight for the castle door. But alas and alack, no such sight greeted her eager eyes, for the high road was quite deserted, and in disappointment she ran back to the henwife to tell her so. "Then it is clear that thy fortune is not coming to meet thee this day," said the old dame, "so thou must e'en come back tomorrow." So the little princess went home again, and next day she turned up once more at the old wife's cottage. But once more she was disappointed, for although she looked out long and eagerly, no glad sight of a coach and six or any other coach greeted her eyes. On the third day, however, what should she see but a great black bull coming rushing along the road, bellowing as it came, and tossing its head fiercely in the air. In great alarm, the little princess shut the door and ran to the henwife to tell her about the furious animal that was approaching. "Eh, Henny," cried the old woman, holding up her hands in dismay, "and who would have thought that the Black Bull of Norroway would be your fate?" At these words, the poor little maiden grew pale. She had come out to seek her fortune, but it had never dawned upon her that her fortune could be anything so terrible as this. "But the bull cannot be my fortune," she cried in terror. "I cannot go away with a bull." "But you'll need to," replied the henwife calmly, "for you look it out of my door with the intent of meeting your fortune, and when your fortune has come to ye, you must toll it." And when the poor princess ran weeping to her mother to beg to be allowed to stay at home, she found her mother of the same mind as the wise woman, and so she had to allow herself to be lifted up on the back of the enormous black bull that had come to the door of the castle, and was now standing there quietly enough. And when she was settled, he set off again on his wild career, while she sobbed and trembled with terror, and clung to his horns with all her might. On and on they went, until at last the poor maiden was so faint with fear and hunger that she could scarce keep her seat. Just as she was losing her hold of the great beast's horns, however, and feeling that she must fall onto the ground, he turned his massive head round a little, and speaking in a wonderfully soft and gentle voice, said, eat out of my right ear, and drink out of my left ear, so wilt thou be refreshed for thy journey." So the princess put a trembling hand into the bull's right ear, and drew out some bread and meat, which in spite of her terror she was glad to swallow. Then she put her hand into his left ear, and found that there was a tiny flagon of wine, and when she had drunk, that her strength returned to her in a wonderful way. Long they went, and sore they rode, till, just as it seemed to the princess that they must be getting near the world's end, they came in sight of a magnificent castle. "That's where we maun bide tonight," said the Black Bull of Norroway, "for that is the house of one of my brothers." And there's an illustration. The princess was greatly surprised at these words, but by this time she was too tired to wonder very much at anything, so she did not answer, but sat still where she was, until the bull ran into the courtyard of the castle and knocked his great head against the door. The door was opened at once by a very splendid footman, who treated the Black Bull with great respect, and helped the princess to alight from his back. Then he ushered her into a magnificent hall, where the lord of the castle and his lady and a great and noble company were assembled, while the Black Bull trotted off quite contentedly to the grassy park which stretched all round the building, to spend the night there. The lord and his lady were very kind to the princess, and gave her supper, and led her to a richly furnished bedroom, all hung round with golden mirrors, and left her to rest there. And in the morning Just as the black bull came trotting up to the front door, they handed her a beautiful apple, telling her not to break it, but to put it in her pocket and keep it till she was in the greatest strait that mortal could be in. Then she was to break it, and it would bring her out of it. So she put the apple in her pocket, and they lifted her once more onto the black bull's back, and she and her strange companion continued on their journey. All that day they traveled farther than I can tell you, and at night they came to the site of another castle, which was even bigger and grander than the first. "That's where we maun bide this night," said the black bull, "for that is the home of another of my brothers." And here the princess rested for the night, in a very fine bedroom indeed, all hung with silken curtains, and the lord and lady of the castle did everything to please her and make her comfortable. And in the morning, before she left, they presented her with the largest pear she had ever seen, and warned her that she must not break it until she was in the direst strait that she had ever been in, and then, if she broke it, it would bring her out of it. The third day was the same, and the other two had been as the other two had been. The princess and the black bull of Norroway rode many a weary mile, and at sundown they came to another castle, more splendid by far than the other two. This castle belonged to the black bull's youngest brother, and here the princess abode all night, while the bull, as usual, lay outside in the park. And this time, when they departed, the princess received a most lovely plum, with the warning not to break it till she was in the greatest strait that mortal could be in. Then she was to break it, and it would set her free. On the fourth day, however, things were changed, for there was no fine castle waiting for them at the end of their journey. On the contrary, as the shadows began to lengthen, and they came to a dark, deep glen, which was so gloomy and so awesome looking that the poor princess felt her courage sinking as they approached it. At the entrance the black bull stopped. "Light down here, lady," he said. "For this glen a deadly conflict awaits me, which I must face unaided and alone. For the dark and gloomy region that lies before us is the abode of a great spirit of darkness, who worketh much ill in the world. I would fain fight with him and overcome him, and, by my troth, I have good hope that I shall do so. As for thee, thou must seat thyself on this stone, and stir neither hand, nor foot, nor tongue, till I return. For if thou but so much as move, then the evil spirit of the glen will have thee in his power." "But how shall I know what is happening to thee?" asked the princess anxiously, for she was beginning to grow quite fond of the huge black creature that had carried her so gallantly these last 4 days. "If I have neither to move hand nor foot, nor yet to speak, thou wilt know by the signs around thee," answered the bull. "For if everything about thee turn blue, then thou wilt know that I have vanquished the evil spirit. But if everything about thee turn red, then the evil spirit hath vanquished me." With these words he departed, and was soon lost to sight in the dark recesses of the glen, leaving the little princess sitting motionless on her stone, afraid to move so much as her little finger, in case some unknown evil fell upon her. At last, when she had sat there for well nigh an hour, a curious change began to pass over the landscape. First it turned gray, and then it turned a deep azure blue, as if the sky had descended on the earth. "The bull hath conquered," thought the princess. "Oh, what a noble animal he is!" And in her relief and delight she moved her position and crossed one leg over the other. Oh, woe a day! In a moment a mystic spell fell upon her. which caused her to become invisible to the eyes of the Prince of Norroway, who, having vanquished the evil spirit, was loosed from the spell which had lain over him, and had transformed him into the likeness of a great black bull, and who returned in haste down the glen to present himself in his rightful form to the maiden whom he loved, and whom he hoped to win for his bride. Long, long he sought, but he could not find her, while all the time she was sitting patiently waiting on the stone. But the spell was on her eyes also, and hindered her from seeing him, as it hindered him from seeing her. So she sat on, till at last she became so wearied and lonely and frightened that she burst out crying, and cried herself to sleep. And when she woke in the morning, she felt that it was no use sitting there any longer, so she rose and took her way, hardly knowing whither she was going. And she went, till the last she came to the great hill made of all glass, which blocked her way and prevented her going any further. She tried time after time to climb it, but it was all of no avail, for the surface of the hill was so slippery that she only managed to climb up a few feet, to slide down again the next moment. So she began to walk round the bottom of the hill in the hope of finding some path that would lead her over it. But the hill was so big, and she was so tired, that it seemed almost hopeless, a hopeless quest, and her spirit died completely within her. And as she went slowly along, sobbing with despair, she felt that if help did not come soon, she must lie down and die. About midday, however, she came to a little cottage, and beside the cottage there was a smithy, where an old smith was working at his anvil. She entered and asked him if he could tell her of any path that would lead her over the mountain. The old man laid down his hammer and looked at her, slowly shaking his head as he did so. "Na, na, lassie," he said, there is no easy road over the mountain of glass. Folkmen either walk round it, which is not an easy thing to do, for the foot of it stretches out for hundreds of miles, and the folk who try to do so are almost sure to lose their way, or they mun walk over the top of it, and that can only be done by those who are shod with iron shoes. "And how am I to get these iron shoes?" cried the princess eagerly. "Couldst thou fashion me a pair, good man? I would gladly pay thee for them." Then she stopped suddenly, for she remembered that she had no money. "These shoes cannot be made for siller," said the old man solemnly. "They can only be earned by service. I alone can make them, and I make them for those who are willing to serve me." "And how long must I serve thee ere thou makest them for me?" asked the princess faintly. 7 years," replied the old man, "for they be magic shoon, and that is the magic number." So as there seemed nothing else for it, the princess hired herself to the smith for 7 long years, to clean his house and cook his food and make and mend his clothes. At the end of that time he fashioned her a pair of iron shoon, with which she climbed the mountain of glass with as much ease as if it had been covered with fresh green turf. When she had reached the summit and descended to the other side, the first house she came to was the house of an old washerwoman who lived there with her only daughter. And as the princess was now very tired, she went up to the door and knocked, and asked if she might be allowed to rest there for the night. The washerwoman, who was old and ugly, with a sly and evil face, said that she might, on one condition, and that was that she should try to wash a white mantle that the Black Knight of Norroway had brought to her to wash. as he had got it stained in a deadly fight. Yestereen I spent an long day washing it, went on the old dame, and I might as well have let it lie on the table, for at night, when I took it out of the wash-tub, the stains were there as dark as ever. Peradventure, maiden, if thou wouldst try thy hand upon it, thou mightest be more successful, for I am loath to disappoint the Black Knight of Norroway, who is exceedingly great and powerful prince. Is he in any way connected with the Black Bull of Norroway? Asked the princess, for the name of her heart had leaped for joy, for it seemed that mayhap she was going to find once more him whom she had lost. The old woman looked at her suspiciously. The two are one, she answered, for the Black Knight chanced to have a spell thrown over him, which turned him into a black bull, and which could not be lifted until he fought with and overcome a mighty spirit of evil that lived in a dark glen. He fought with the spirit and overcame it, and once more regained his true form. But 'tis said that his mind is somewhat clouded at times, for he speaketh ever of a maiden whom he would fain have wedded, and whom he hath lost. Though who or what she was, no living person kens. But this story can have to interest to a stranger like thee, she added slowly, as if she were sorry for having said so much. I have no more time to waste in talking, but if thou wilt try and wash the mantle, thou art welcome to a night's lodging, and if not, I must ask thee to go on thy way. Needlessly to say, the princess said that she would try and wash the mantle, and it seemed as if her fingers had some magic power in them, for as soon as she put it into water, the stains vanished, and it became white and clean, and when it was new. Of course the old woman was delighted, but she was very suspicious also, for it appeared to her that there must have been some mysterious link between the maiden and the knight, if his mantle became clean so easily when she washed it, when it had remained soiled and stained in spite of all the labor which she and her daughter had bestowed upon it. So, as she knew that the young gallant intended returning for it that very night, and as she wanted her daughter to get the credit of washing it, she advised the princess to go to bed early, in order to get a good night's rest after all her labors. And the princess followed her advice, and thus it came about that she was sound asleep, safely hidden in the big box bed in the corner, when the Black Knight of Norroway came into the cottage to claim his white mantle. Now you must know that the young man had carried about this mantle with him for the last 7 years, ever since his encounter with the evil spirit of the glen, always trying to find someone who could wash it for him, and never succeeding, for it had been revealed to him by a wise woman that she who could make it white and clean was destined to be his wife, be she bonny or ugly, old or young, and that moreover she would prove a loving and a faithful and a true helpmeet. So when he came to the washerwoman's cottage and received back his mantle white as the driven snow, he heard that it was the washerwoman's daughter who had wrought this wondrous change. He said at once that he would marry her, and that the very next day. When the princess awoke in the morning and heard all that had befallen, and how the Black Knight had come to the cottage while she was asleep, and had received his mantle, and had promised to marry the washerwoman's daughter that very day, her heart was like to break, for now she felt that she never would have a chance of speaking to him and telling him who she really was. And in her sore distress, she suddenly remembered the beautiful fruit which she had received on her journey 7 long years before, which she had carried with her ever since. Surely I will never be sorer straight than I am now, she said to herself, and she drew out the apple and broke it. And lo and behold, it was filled with the most beautiful precious stones that she had ever seen. And in the sight of them, a plan came suddenly to her head. She took the precious stones out of the apple, and putting them into a corner of her kerchief, carried them to the washerwoman. See, said she, I am richer than mayhap thou thoughtest I was, and if thou wilt, all these riches may be thine. And how would that come about? Asked the old woman eagerly, for she had never seen so many precious stones in her life before, and she had a great desire to become the possessor of them. Only put off thy daughter's wedding for one day, replied the princess, and let me watch beside the Black Knight as he sleeps this night, for I have long had a great desire to see him. To her astonishment, the washerwoman agreed to this request, for the wily old woman was very anxious to get the jewels which would make her rich for life, and it did not seem to her that there was any harm in the princess's request, for she had made up her mind that she would give the Black Knight a sleeping draught, which would effectually prevent him as much as speaking to the strange maiden. So she took the jewels and locked them up in her kiss. And the wedding was put off, and that night the little princess slipped into the Black Knight's apartment when he was asleep, and watched all through the long hours by his bedside, singing this song to keep him in the hope that he would awake and hear it. 7 long years I served for thee, the glassy hill I climbed for thee, the mantle white I washed for thee, and wilt thou no waken and turn to me? But although she sang it over and over again, as if her heart would burst, he neither listened nor stirred, for the old washerwoman's potion had made sure of that. Next morning, in her great trouble, the little princess broke open the pear, hoping that its contents would help her better than the contents of the apple had done. But in it she found just what she had found before, a heap of precious stones, only they were richer and more valuable than the others had been. So, as it seemed the only thing to do, she carried them to the old woman and bribed her to put the wedding off for yet another day, and allow her to watch that night also by the Black Prince's bedside. And the washerwoman did so, for, said she, as she locked away the stones, I shall soon grow quite rich at this rate. But alas, it was all in vain that the princess spent the long hours singing with all her might. 7 long years I served for thee, the glassy hill I climbed for thee, the mantle white I washed for thee, and wilt thou no waken to turn to me? For the young prince, whom she watched so tenderly, remained deaf and motionless as a stone. By the morning she had almost lost hope, for there was only the plum remaining now, and if that failed, her last chance had gone. With trembling fingers she broke it open, and found inside another collection of precious stones, richer and rarer than the others. She ran with these to the washerwoman, and throwing them into her lap, told her she could keep them all, and welcome it if she would put off the wedding once again, and let her watch by the prince for one more night. And greatly wondering, the old woman consented. Now it chanced that the Black Knight, tired with waiting for his wedding, went out hunting that day, with all his attendants behind him. And as the servants rode, they talked together about something that had puzzled them sorely these 2 nights gone by. At last, an old huntsman rode up to the knight, with a question upon his lips. Master, he said, we would fain know who the sweet singer is who singeth through the night in thy chamber. Singer? He repeated. There is no singer. My chamber hath been quiet as the grave, and I have slept a dreamless sleep ever since I came to live at the cottage." The old huntsman shook his head. "Taste not thee the old wife's draught this night, master," he said earnestly. "Then wilt thou hear what other ears have heard." At other times the Black Knight would have laughed at his words, but today the man spoke with such earnestness that he could not but listen to him. So that evening, when the washerwoman, as her wont, brought his sleeping draught of spiced ale to his bedside, he told her that it was not sweet enough for his liking. And when she turned and went to the kitchen to fetch some honey to sweeten it, he jumped out of bed and poured it all out of the window. And when she came back and pretended that he had drunk it. So it came to pass that he lay awake that night and heard the princess enter his room, and listened to her plaintive little song, sung in a voice that was full of sobs. 7 long years I served for thee, the glassy hill I climbed for thee, the mantle white I washed for thee, and wilt thou not waken and turn to me?" And when he heard it, he understood it all, and he sprang up and took her in his arms and kissed her, and asked her to tell him the whole story. And when he heard it, he was so angry with the old washerwoman and her deceitful daughter that he ordered them to leave the country at once, and he married the little princess, and they lived happily all their days. And that was The Black Bull of Norroway. And the conclusion of this particular episode. I hope you enjoyed episode 36 of Wicked Shizuku's Reviews Monday Reads. And if you found this educational or entertaining, please like, subscribe, and share, as it helps my channel out. Have a good evening. Thanks for watching.